Maria was a strong woman with a warm smile. She had always been full of energy. But now, 8 months pregnant, her life had slowed down. A recent accident had confined her to a wheelchair, but she refused to let it dim her spirit. Maria lived in a peaceful neighborhood with her husband, Ethan. Ethan was an FBI agent, a calm and focused man who loved his wife deeply. Even with his busy and secretive job, he always found time to make Maria feel cared for. That morning, Maria had plans to visit the grocery store. She enjoyed picking out fresh fruits and vegetables herself, even if she needed some extra help these days. She felt proud of her independence. Ethan had kissed her on the forehead before leaving for work, reminding her to call if she needed anything. "Be safe," he said, with his usual calm but protective tone. Maria's wheelchair wasn't just a tool, it had become part of her strength. She knew people sometimes looked at her with pity, but she didn't see herself as weak. She was determined to live her life as normally as possible, even if that meant some challenges along the way. The streets were quiet as Maria wheeled herself to the small local market. She enjoyed the crisp morning air and the cheerful greetings of her neighbors. At the store, the employees knew her well and often helped her with heavy items. Today was no different. She smiled as she added a few things to her cart, imagining the dinner she would prepare for Ethan that evening. As Maria moved toward the checkout counter, she noticed a police car parked near the entrance. She didn't think much of it. Police officers often stopped by the store for coffee or a quick snack. However, something about the officer standing near the car caught her attention. He looked tense and impatient, pacing as if he was annoyed about something. Maria decided to keep to herself and focus on getting home. After paying for her groceries, Maria began her journey back. She carefully balanced the bag on her lap, smiling politely at passersby. But as she neared a crosswalk, the sound of the officer's voice startled her. He was yelling at someone across the street. His tone was sharp and demanding. Maria glanced over and saw a young man hurrying away, shaking his head. Maria didn't want to get involved, so she tried to wheel past quietly. However, the officer suddenly turned his attention to her. "Hey, you, stop right there," he shouted. Maria froze, confused and nervous. She wasn't sure why he was addressing her. The officer walked toward her, his expression stern. "What's in the bag?" he asked, pointing to her groceries. Maria stammered, "Just some food. I live nearby." But the officer wasn't satisfied with her answer, and his approach was anything but kind. Maria's heart began to race as she realized this encounter might not end as peacefully as she had hoped. Maria's hands gripped the wheels of her chair tightly as the officer approached her. He was tall, with a serious expression and a sharp tone in his voice. His badge read, "Officer Blake." Maria felt her heart race, unsure why he had stopped her. She looked up at him, trying to keep calm. "Are you trying to ignore me?" Officer Blake asked sternly. "No, sir," Maria replied, her voice soft but steady. "I just came from the store. I'm heading home." Blake looked suspiciously at the bag of groceries on her lap. "Let me see what's in the bag," he demanded. Maria hesitated. She didn't understand why he wanted to check her bag. "It's just food," she said, trying to explain. "I bought some vegetables, milk, and bread." "Open it," he insisted, his voice louder this time. Maria felt uneasy. People walking by began to stop and stare. She didn't like being the center of attention, but she also didn't want to cause trouble. Slowly, she opened the bag, showing him the contents. There was nothing but the groceries she had mentioned. Officer Blake glanced inside but didn't seem satisfied. "Where's your ID?" he asked. Maria reached into her purse and handed it to him. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she tried to stay calm. Blake looked at her ID, then back at her. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked. "I'm going home," Maria repeated, keeping her tone polite. "I live just a few blocks away." Blake's demeanor didn't soften. Instead, he seemed irritated. "You don't look like you belong here," he muttered. Maria was taken aback. She lived in this neighborhood for years with her husband. Why would he think she didn't belong? She felt a lump in her throat, but held back her emotions. I've lived here for a long time, Maria said, her voice steady but firm. This is my home. The people around them began murmuring. Some looked uncomfortable, while others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Maria noticed their curious faces, but no one stepped forward to help. She felt small and vulnerable, but she wasn't going to let fear take over. Blake crossed his arms, looking at her wheelchair with a skeptical eye. "Why don't you have someone with you?" he asked, as if she couldn't take care of herself. "I'm independent," Maria replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I can manage." Blake seemed annoyed by her response. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he snapped. "It's not safe." Maria wanted to argue, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she said, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine." Blake's face grew harder. "Fine," he said, stepping back, "but don't make me stop you again." Maria nodded, relieved that the encounter was over. She adjusted her bag and began wheeling herself away. But as she moved, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last she would see of Officer Blake. Maria thought the encounter was over as she wheeled herself toward home. Her heart was still pounding, but she reassured herself it had passed. She just wanted to forget about Officer Blake and get back to her peaceful day. But as she turned the corner, she heard heavy footsteps behind her. She glanced back and froze. Officer Blake was following her, his expression stern. Maria's stomach sank. What did he want now? "Hold on," Blake called out. "I'm not done with you yet." Maria stopped her wheelchair, unsure of what to do. A small group of onlookers began to gather, whispering among themselves. Maria's voice trembled slightly as she said, "Sir, I've shown you everything. I really need to get home." Blake's face grew stern. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked. "People like you always have something to hide." Maria's eyes widened. "People like me," she repeated, feeling confused and hurt. "You're acting suspicious," Blake said, ignoring her question. "Nobody's going anywhere until I'm satisfied." Maria felt a wave of panic. She didn't understand why he was targeting her. She had done nothing wrong. The people around her were now filming the interaction with their phones, and she could hear them murmuring words like unfair and intimidation. "I've answered all your questions," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please, just let me go home." But instead of backing off, Blake stepped closer, towering over her. "I'm the one who decides when this is over," he said. "Don't tell me what to do." Maria's hands gripped the wheels of her chair tightly. She was scared, but she also felt a spark of defiance. She wasn't going to let herself be bullied. "I'm not trying to argue with you, sir," she said. "I've cooperated. There's no reason to hold me here." Blake's expression darkened. "Don't raise your voice at me," he snapped, even though Maria's tone had been calm. The crowd began to grow restless. Some people shouted, "Leave her alone." And "She hasn't done anything wrong." But Blake ignored them. Maria's heart was pounding. She thought of Ethan and wished he were there. He always knew how to handle difficult situations, but she reminded herself that she wasn't helpless. She took a deep breath and said firmly, "I have the right to leave." Blake's face turned red with frustration. "You think you're smarter than me," he said, his voice rising. "Fine. Let's see what your husband thinks about this when I file a report." Maria blinked in surprise. He didn't know who her husband was. The thought made her feel a small flicker of hope. If Ethan were here, he would know exactly what to do. As Blake continued to lecture her, Maria noticed one of the bystanders stepping forward. It was a middle-aged woman who looked determined. "This is wrong," the woman said loudly. "She hasn't done anything. Leave her alone." Blake turned toward the woman, momentarily distracted. Maria seized the chance to wheel herself away, her heart pounding as she headed toward safety. Maria's heart was still racing as she wheeled herself home. She had never been so shaken by a simple trip to the store. As she reached her front door, she could barely hold the grocery bag steady in her lap. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Ethan had just left for work that morning, but Maria couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number, her fingers trembling. It rang for a few seconds before his voice answered. "Hey, love. Everything okay?" Ethan's voice was calm and reassuring, just as it always was. Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Ethan, I need to tell you something. Something happened today," she said, her voice cracking. "A police officer stopped me outside the store." Ethan's voice immediately changed. "What happened?" he asked, his tone now serious. He was rude, Ethan. He stopped me for no reason. And when I tried to explain, he just kept being rude. He wouldn't let me go. I had to leave, but he was so aggressive. It wasn't right." Ethan's silence on the other end of the line made Maria nervous. She could hear the sharp sound of his breathing, as if he was thinking carefully. "I'll be home soon," he said. "Don't worry. I'm going to look into this." Ethan was an FBI agent. He wasn't just any ordinary man. He was used to handling difficult situations, but Maria hated to trouble him with something like this. She had been trying to keep things normal, but now it felt like everything was falling apart. She sat down on the couch, staring at the floor, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. Why had Officer Blake singled her out? It wasn't fair. She had done nothing wrong, but somehow she felt like she was the one in trouble. An hour later, the front door opened, and Ethan stepped inside. He was already in his FBI uniform, his face serious. Maria stood up quickly, feeling relieved, but also worried about what would happen next. Ethan pulled her into a hug, his arms strong and comforting. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, Maria," he whispered. "You don't deserve that." As he pulled away, he looked at her with a hard expression. "I'm going to find out who that officer is. Don't worry. We'll handle this." Maria nodded. She felt safe with Ethan by her side, knowing he would take charge. He was used to handling high-pressure situations, and Maria trusted him completely. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this would not be an easy fight. Ethan pulled out his phone and began making calls. He was calm and precise, talking to colleagues at the local police department and gathering information. Maria watched as he worked, feeling proud of her husband, but also scared of what he might uncover. After a few minutes, Ethan looked at her. "I got some information on him," he said quietly. "His name is Officer Blake. I'm going to dig deeper into this, but we're going to get this sorted out." Maria sat back down on the couch, feeling a wave of relief. She had no idea what would happen next, but with Ethan's help, she knew they could face whatever came their way. Ethan didn't waste any time. As soon as he had gathered enough information about Officer Blake, he knew what had to be done. Maria sat quietly, watching him as he moved around the living room, preparing himself for what was ahead. His face was calm, but Maria could see the determination in his eyes. "I'm going to the police station," Ethan said, grabbing his jacket. "I'll find Blake and speak to him. We need to know exactly what happened." Maria nodded, still feeling a little uneasy. She didn't want Ethan to get caught up in this. She knew how dangerous his job could be, but this was different. This was personal. She didn't want to see him in danger because of some unfair situation with a police officer. "Be careful," Maria said softly. Ethan turned to face her, his expression softening. "I'll be fine, Maria. You don't have to worry." He kissed her forehead before heading out the door, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts. She felt helpless but also hopeful. Ethan knew how to handle these situations. He had the training, the skills, and the experience to make sure things didn't go too far. At the police station, Officer Blake was sitting at his desk, looking through some papers when Ethan walked in. Blake looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting to see anyone, especially not an FBI agent. "Can I help you, officer?" Blake asked, his voice a little too casual. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Blake's with a calm but serious stare. "You can help me by explaining why you harassed my wife today," Ethan said, his tone controlled but firm. Blake's face turned pale for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to act innocent. "Your wife was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job." Ethan didn't flinch. "I've already seen the footage, Blake. I've spoken to witnesses. Everyone around her saw you stop her for no reason. You treated her like a criminal when all she was doing was getting some groceries. Is that how you treat every citizen?" Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught off guard. "Look, I was just trying to be thorough," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady but intense. "You don't get to bully people just because you're having a bad day. You don't get to treat my wife like that. You crossed the line, and now it's time to answer for it." Blake's eyes darted around the room, his nervousness growing. "I didn't mean any harm," he muttered, but Ethan wasn't buying it. "No harm," Ethan repeated, his voice calm but with an edge. "You shoved her wheelchair, Blake. You made her feel scared, alone, and unsafe. And now you're going to be held accountable for your actions." Blake stood up, trying to look taller, but it was clear that Ethan's words had shaken him. "I didn't." "You will be investigated," Ethan interrupted. "You'll face the consequences of your actions. I'll make sure of it." Ethan turned to leave, his mind focused on the next steps. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't backing down. Not when it came to protecting Maria. He would make sure justice was served. Ethan knew that the confrontation with Officer Blake wasn't the end of the story. There was still a lot more work to do, and he had to make sure that justice would be served. He couldn't let what happened to Maria just slip away. His training had taught him to handle all kinds of situations, but this one was personal. Maria was his priority. Back at home, Maria was waiting for Ethan, pacing around the living room. She had tried to relax, but her mind kept racing. She wanted to know how Ethan was doing, what had happened at the police station. Was Officer Blake going to face consequences for his actions? Would everything turn out okay? When Ethan finally came home, Maria could tell right away that he was focused. His face was serious, but there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes. He walked toward her and gave her a quick hug before sitting down next to her. "I spoke to him," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "Blake was defensive, of course, but I made it clear that I won't let this go." Maria nodded, feeling a bit of weight lift off her shoulders. Ethan was handling everything. She trusted him completely, but she also knew that things were far from over. Officer Blake had a lot of power, and he wasn't going to let this situation go quietly. Ethan continued, "I've already contacted some of my colleagues at the FBI. We're going to look into Blake's past. He has a record of complaints and misconduct, and this is just another one to add to the list." Maria listened carefully. She didn't want to get her hopes up too soon, but the idea that Blake's actions could be part of a larger pattern made her feel like something was being done. Ethan pulled out his phone and started typing. "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the police department, and I've already spoken to the right people at the bureau. We'll make sure Blake faces an investigation." Maria felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She was relieved that Ethan wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. He had the power and resources to make sure things didn't get swept under the rug. "I know it's not easy, Maria," Ethan said, looking into her eyes. "But this is the right thing to do. Blake needs to be held accountable for how he treated you." Maria sighed, feeling a mix of emotions. She was thankful for Ethan's support, but at the same time, the whole experience had shaken her. She had never imagined that a simple trip to the store could turn into such a nightmare. She had always felt safe in her neighborhood, but now everything felt uncertain. "I just don't want this to happen to anyone else," she said softly. Ethan smiled at her, his expression full of understanding. "I know. That's why we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. We'll get the truth out there, and we'll do it the right way." Ethan's determination gave Maria a sense of hope. She knew they were doing the right thing by standing up against Officer Blake's actions. As difficult as the situation was, it was also the beginning of something bigger, a chance to make sure no one else would ever feel as afraid and helpless as she had. "I'm with you, Ethan," Maria said quietly, squeezing his hand. "We'll get through this together." Ethan nodded. Together. In the days following Ethan's visit to the police station, the situation with Officer Blake began to unfold in unexpected ways. Ethan was busy working with his colleagues at the FBI, gathering all the necessary evidence to ensure that Blake would be held accountable for his actions. But Maria, though relieved that Ethan was taking charge, still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She kept thinking about that moment in the parking lot when Officer Blake had confronted her. The way he had acted, so angry and aggressive, had left a deep mark on her. But now, with Ethan's support, Maria felt a new sense of determination. She wasn't going to let this go. She would stand up for herself and for anyone else who might be treated unfairly. One afternoon, as Maria was sitting in the living room, she heard a knock at the door. It was unexpected, and she wondered who could be visiting. She wheeled herself to the door and opened it, finding a young man holding a folder in his hand. "Hi, I'm Detective Anderson from the police department," he said politely. "I'm here to talk to you about the incident with Officer Blake." Maria was surprised but grateful. She invited the detective inside and offered him a seat. As they sat down, Maria explained everything that had happened on the day she encountered Officer Blake. She told him how the officer had treated her and how she had felt powerless in that moment. Detective Anderson listened carefully, taking notes. When she finished, he looked at her seriously. "I've reviewed the footage from the security cameras outside the store," he said. "We also have several witness statements, and it's clear that Officer Blake overstepped his boundaries. His behavior was completely unacceptable." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, it seemed like someone in authority was taking her seriously. Detective Anderson assured her that Blake would be investigated thoroughly, and the department would not ignore the complaints against him. "We're going to handle this carefully," Detective Anderson said. "We want to make sure you and your husband are safe, and we're going to make sure Officer Blake is held responsible for his actions." As the detective left, Maria felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there would be justice. She called Ethan to tell him the good news, and he was just as relieved as she was. "Sounds like things are moving forward," Ethan said over the phone. "I'm glad they're taking this seriously." Maria agreed. She felt proud of how far they had come, but she knew this wasn't the end. Officer Blake was still on the job, and the investigation was just beginning. She couldn't let her guard down just yet, but with Ethan by her side, and the police department now involved, she knew she wasn't alone. As the investigation into Officer Blake continued, news of the incident began to spread. It wasn't long before the media picked up on the story. People all over the city were talking about what had happened, and public support began to grow. Many were outraged by how Blake had treated Maria, and some even reached out to her to offer support. Maria felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, relief, but also a deep sense of injustice. She had never imagined that something like this could happen to her, but now that it had, she felt empowered to speak out. As the days went by, the investigation into Officer Blake's actions moved forward. Detective Anderson had kept Maria and Ethan updated on the progress, and every step seemed to bring them closer to justice. Maria had felt a weight lift off her shoulders when the police department confirmed that Blake was being placed on administrative leave until the investigation was complete. For the first time since that terrible day at the store, Maria felt like she could breathe a little easier. But despite the relief, the case wasn't over yet. Ethan continued to work closely with the FBI to dig into Blake's past, and what they discovered was shocking. Blake had been involved in multiple complaints of misconduct over the years. Each time, the cases had been overlooked or dismissed. But now, with clear evidence against him and the public watching closely, things were different. News outlets picked up the story, and it quickly became a hot topic. The public was outraged by what had happened to Maria, and many people began calling for accountability. Social media buzzed with comments and posts demanding justice for her. Maria felt a little overwhelmed by the attention, but she was also grateful that her voice was being heard. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for others who had experienced the same unfair treatment. On the morning of the hearing, Ethan stood by her side as they made their way to the courthouse. Maria's hands were shaking slightly, but Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "You've got this," he said softly. "We're in this together." As they entered the courtroom, they saw that it was packed with people. News cameras were set up in the back, and reporters were milling around, ready to cover the hearing. Maria couldn't help but feel a little nervous, but she knew this was an important moment. This was her chance to make sure that Officer Blake was held responsible for his actions. The hearing began, and Ethan spoke first. He presented the evidence of Blake's misconduct, including witness testimonies and video footage from the day of the incident. The room was silent as the facts were laid out. Blake sat at the defense table, looking nervous and uncomfortable, his once confident demeanor gone. He tried to defend himself, but his excuses were weak. The evidence was too strong, and the truth was undeniable. After a tense few hours, the judge made her ruling. Officer Blake was found guilty of misconduct and assault. The room erupted in applause, and Maria couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. It had been a long, difficult road, but it had led to this moment. Justice for her and for everyone who had been treated unfairly by people in power. Maria looked at Ethan, her heart full of gratitude. "We did it," she whispered. Ethan smiled and squeezed her hand. "We did it together." After the hearing, the media covered the story extensively. People across the city were celebrating the victory, and Maria received countless messages of support. She had become a symbol of resilience and strength, and her story inspired many others to speak up about their own experiences. In the end, Maria and Ethan knew that this victory wasn't just about one officer. It was about making sure that everyone, no matter who they were, could feel safe and treated with respect. They had made a difference, and that was something they could both be proud of. After the trial, life slowly began to settle back into a more peaceful rhythm for Maria and Ethan. The victory in the courtroom was still fresh in their minds, but they both knew it was time to focus on the future. The journey they had gone through had changed them, and they were determined to make sure it didn't go to waste. Maria found herself thinking more about her own strength. For so long, she had let her wheelchair define her, but now she realized that it didn't have to. The ordeal with Officer Blake had reminded her that she was capable of standing up for herself, no matter the circumstances. And with Ethan by her side, she knew she was never truly alone. Together, they were a team, and nothing could break the bond they shared. Ethan, too, had changed. The case had reminded him of the importance of justice, not just in his work as an FBI agent, but in the everyday world. He had always been dedicated to his job, but after seeing what happened to Maria, he felt more deeply connected to the people he protected. His work had always been about solving problems, but now it felt personal. He knew that sometimes it wasn't just about the case. It was about making a real difference in people's lives. As the weeks passed, the media slowly moved on to other stories, but Maria and Ethan continued their quiet life. They took small steps toward a new normal. Maria continued to care for herself, managing her pregnancy with determination, and Ethan kept working on his cases, now with a renewed sense of purpose. The couple also began to talk more openly about their future. With their baby on the way, they had a lot to look forward to. The challenges they faced only made them more excited about starting a family together. They dreamed of a world where their child would grow up in a place where kindness and respect were at the heart of every community. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Ethan turned to Maria with a soft smile. "You know," he said, "I think we've learned a lot from everything that's happened, but there's still so much we can do." Maria nodded, her hand resting on her growing belly. I know. We can't let what happened just be something in the past. We have to keep pushing for change, even in small ways. Maybe we can help others who've been treated unfairly. Ethan squeezed her hand. Exactly. We don't have to change the world overnight, but we can start by making sure that people feel heard. That's how real change happens. Maria smiled at him, feeling more hopeful than she had in a long time. The road ahead might still have challenges, but now she felt ready to face them. With Ethan by her side and a baby on the way, they were ready for whatever the future held. As they sat together, looking out the window at the sunset, they knew one thing for certain. They had the power to make a difference, and their journey was only just beginning.